By this time of the year, I would hope that you have already filed your taxes and you either are expecting a refund or else you have paid what you owe. Of course, this year is a little bit different than usual because they have given an extension of a couple of months for you to file your taxes. But as for me, I prefer to stay on the regular schedule because I also have quarterly payments to make every quarter, and they are due on April 15th, as well as my regular taxes. And so I paid my regular taxes on April 15th. And like some of you, I got a stimulus check from the government. And the very next day, after it was deposited into my account, I gave it right back to the government in order to pay my quarterly taxes that were due. And it took all of the stimulus check and then some. But every year at this time, I feel resentful and robbed. I feel like income tax on one or tax on one's income is government thievery. But that doesn't mean that I or most of us resent those who work in tax collection. In fact, I have even been audited once, and I did not resent the agent that worked for the IRS because, as soon as I showed her that my files were in order and that my figures were correct, all that I had to lose was time, and I just figured she was doing her job. And that's the way most of us feel about tax collectors these days. But it wasn't like that in the first century among the Jewish society when the Jews paid taxes to Rome. They not only resented paying their taxes, they resented those who collected the taxes. They were resentful not only of the system, but of the tax gatherers, and the resentment was partly due to the fact that many Jewish families were literally taxed into poverty. And that's not hard for me to imagine. As much taxes as I pay and as much taxes as I know some others pay, it's not really hard to imagine being taxed into poverty. But back in those days, with all the taxes added up, a person would spend about 2/3 of their income just paying the government. And the Jews had been under Roman domination for almost a century. And what's more, the Romans had recruited Jewish tax collectors to extract this money from their own countrymen, and this to support a foreign power. And so some tax collector jobs went to the highest bidder. Wealthy Jews would take these jobs, and then the Romans would allow them the leeway to set their own assessment fees for taxable items, and also they would allow them to have their own set commission as to what they would receive. And so not only did the people pay the taxes, but they also paid the commission on the taxes to the tax collectors, who were making a lot of money off their own countrymen for the Roman government. And this money went to the upkeep of the luxurious lifestyles of the Caesars and the Senate. And so it's not like the Jews had a lot to show for their exorbitant taxes. It's not like this was going for bridges and roads. You don't have to read very far into the New Testament to realize that tax collectors are a despised lot. Even children realize that. One day when our daughter Erin was about 3 years old, I was sitting at the table explaining to Gretchen about this man I was trying to help. I was trying to minister to him. And she asked, is this man a Christian? And I said, no, he's not a Christian. And I did not know that our cute little 3-year-old curly-haired daughter was even listening to this conversation. But she looked at me shocked and said, he's not a Christian? And she didn't even know who he was talking about, but she just found it appalling that someone is not a Christian. And I said, no, he's not a Christian. And then without missing a beat, she said, is he a tax collector? And she said it in that baby voice like, is he a tax collector? And so, see, she got it from just having been in Bible class. She knew that these tax collectors were in a despised category, as if the opposite of Christian was tax collector. And some collectors worked out in the fields. They extracted revenue from individuals. Others sat at toll booths collecting tariffs and customs. And Matthew was one of those because he left his toll booth in order to follow Jesus. But tax collectors were considered traitors, especially by a very nationalistic group known as the Pharisees. Now, we don't have to read far into the New Testament before we know that the Pharisees are apparently the bad guys. And over again, they seem to be the foil against which Jesus makes his most profound pronouncements. But were these guys simply a literary vehicle? Are the Pharisees just straw men for Jesus to best in debate in order to gain the reader's support? No, the Pharisees were real people with a real agenda. I don't think that the current readers of the Bible know too much about the Pharisees or the tax collectors, but we often find the two groups at odds. For example, in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, we have both a Pharisee and a tax collector praying at the temple. This is a parable that Jesus told. The Pharisees' prayer was very haughty, very proud, while the tax collector's was very humble. The tax collector goes home justified, and the Pharisee does not. And that's no surprise to us, because we've heard the story. But for those who originally listened to Jesus' parable for the first time that it was told, this was an amazing shock to them, that the Pharisee did not go home justified, but that the tax collector did. And this was as shocking as the punchline of most of the parables that Jesus told to people, which usually blindsided them with some unexpected element. And the shocker ending in this case is that the Pharisee is portrayed in a bad light, while the tax collector is portrayed in a favorable light. The Pharisees were devoutly religious people, while the tax collectors probably didn't make it to many religious services because they knew that they would not be accepted. And so why is the tax collector justified over the Pharisee? Well, to answer that, we need to understand who the Pharisees were versus who the tax collectors were, and what the word justified actually means. And the answers to those questions could forever change the way that many people, if not most people, read the New Testament. So bear with me as I give you some background, and I'll try not to be too academic. Now, we've looked at the tax collectors. We know who they were. But who were the Pharisees? The name Pharisee could mean one of a couple of different definitions. It could mean sharp in the sense of accurate, or it could mean separatists or the separated ones. And so the Pharisees sharply separated themselves from the people of the world in order to pursue holiness. Greek culture had been spreading throughout the known world for generations by the first century through commerce and colonization. But once Alexander the Great had conquered most of the known world, the Greek culture continued to spread like wildfire through conquest. And after his death, his territories were divided among his generals, and the Jewish homeland of Palestine was right in the middle of two of those territories. To the north, there was the territory belonging to the Seleucid Empire, and the Syrians ran that. The capital was Damascus. But to the south of Palestine was another kingdom, the kingdom of the Ptolemies, who ruled the Jews for over 100 years, and the Jews fared very well under them. But in 198 BC, I believe it was, the Syrian king, he defeated Egypt and took Palestine away from them, it being a buffer state in the middle of the two kingdoms. And so now the Jews were under the Syrian rule. And so with that, Antiochus IV, the king of Syria, he wanted to turn Jerusalem into a Greek city. And the Greek culture by this point had become so widespread that even in Rome, the street language was Greek. And in Alexandria, Egypt, the Bible had been translated into Greek because so many Jews no longer spoke Hebrew. According to Robert Gundry's Old Testament survey, Antiochus built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, and adjacent to that gymnasium, and by the way, in that gymnasium, young men would exercise without any clothes, as they did throughout the Greek Empire, and this, of course, appalled the pious Jewish people. But adjacent to that gym, there was a racetrack, and the events in that racetrack included prayers and incense to pagan deities, and these were attended by some of the prominent Jewish priests. The transformation to Greek culture also included attendance at the Greek theater and the adoption of Greek clothing. And lots of people were exchanging their Hebrew names for Greek ones. Can you imagine how this would have upset the pious Jews, especially some of the older folks? Their ancient culture was disappearing before their eyes. Their people were being assimilated. And once a Jewish battle over the priesthood ensued, Antiochus took this as Jewish rebellion, and he reacted by outlawing circumcision. He outlawed keeping the Sabbath, and he outlawed the Jewish festivals. The Jewish ways were disappearing. And finally, he had prostitutes staffed in the temple courts in the Jewish temple, and he erected a statue of Zeus in the Jewish temple as well. But the last straw for the Jews, the last straw, is when he sacrificed abominable, unclean beasts on the altar of God, which included the sacrifice of a pig. And this sparked the Maccabean revolt in Jewish history, where the Jews took back their land from their Syrian pagan occupiers. And the Pharisees grew out of this group who opposed the foreign and pagan transformation of their culture, which happened to be bound up with their religion. Their religion and their culture could not be separated. And so the Pharisees rebelled against the Syrians. What the Pharisees came to emphasize most were the practices that King Antiochus had outlawed. Things like circumcision, Sabbath keeping, and feast days. The Pharisees were admittedly concerned about assimilation. Their people had fought assimilation and the eradication of Jewish culture for centuries. They had fought against being assimilated into the Egyptian culture and the cultures of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and now the Romans. They wielded all the influence they could. Although the Pharisees were not an official group by any means, they were a pressure group, a grassroots movement to keep the culture of the Jews from disappearing. And it reminds me of some stories that my wife and daughter have been telling me about a book that they have been reading, a book for young readers actually, but it's a historical novel about an Indian school, a Native American school in Pennsylvania. And after the defeat of Custer, Native American children were brought to the school by train from out west, where they were supposedly to learn how to be civilized. And one of the first things that happened when they got there is they gave up their clothes, and their clothes were burned, so they traded their buckskins for cotton. Their hair was cut, which was very devastating to the Sioux children because cutting their hair was a sign of mourning. They were encouraged, in fact forced, to speak the white man's tongue rather than their own language, and each child was given a new name, being told that their former name was their heathen name. And this is like what the Jews went through for centuries. The Pharisees were bent upon preserving the Jewish way of life by keeping the traditions, especially in time of Roman occupation, when they once more found themselves occupied by pagan rule. And so we come back to the parable of these two men standing in the temple. One is a Pharisee, the bulwark of Jewish nationalism. The other is a tax collector, who was thought to have forfeited his Jewish identity by signing on with the Romans. The Jews, or rather the Pharisees, would stop at nothing in preserving their heritage. But a distance away stands this tax collector who probably thinks he's unworthy to even approach the temple proper. And these two men could hardly be any more opposite. In fact, their prayers that they prayed were very opposite. The Pharisee's prayer was a prayer of pride in which he congratulated himself, but the tax collector's prayer expressed his humility. The Pharisee wore his Jewish identity like a badge of honor, while again the tax collector was thought to have forfeited his Jewish identity. And in verse 9 of Luke 18, this parable is addressed to those who were confident in their own righteousness. Or as the King James had it, they trusted in themselves that they were righteous. In other words, the Pharisee is a self-righteous person. Now, some immediately think that that means legalistic, as if one achieved his righteousness by earning it. And this is where we might have woefully misunderstood the Pharisees. It's been common for Christians throughout the ages to identify the Pharisees with whomever their current religious opponents happen to be, with whoever seems to them to be opposing the gospel at the present time. And for Martin Luther, this meant identifying the Pharisees with the Roman Catholic opponents who apparently enforced a meritorious system of works as a means of being right with God. And this system of works included things like penance, indulgences, and the like. And while the binding of rituals have changed since the Pharisees, Luther saw this as a matter of salvation by works. But is that really a fair assessment of the Pharisees? Being confident of his own righteousness did not mean that the Pharisee thought he had saved himself by his works. Righteousness is a matter of fidelity to the covenant and not a matter of meriting one's own salvation. For the Pharisee to be confident of his righteousness meant that he saw himself as merely being a faithful Jew. And what made him think that he was is the fact that he observed the law. He was likely truthful in verse 10 when he denies having been a robber, an evildoer, or an adulterer. He had likely not done those things. He also went beyond the call of duty in terms of Jewish identity markers, what N.T. Wright calls the Jewish identity markers. In verse 12 he says, I fast twice a week, and I give a tenth of all I get. That was actually more than what the law required. While fasting was optional most of the time, it was commanded only once a year in the law of Moses, only once a year, but the Pharisees did it twice a week, just to double down on their Jewish identity, their Jewish heritage, and ensure that they would not be assimilated by pagans. And moreover, the Pharisee tithed on everything he got. Now, the law required tithes from one's livestock, one's fields, and one's earnings, but the Pharisees went beyond even this, even tithing on their spendings. Whenever they bought something in the marketplace, they would pay a percentage of it back to the temple. And you might notice that in the New Testament, Pharisees were very obsessive about ritualistic hand washing. Now, these days we're supposed to be very obsessive about hand washing, but for different reasons. For the Pharisees, it wasn't hygienic, but symbolic of spiritual and national purity. They even indulged in the ceremonial washings intended for the priests, but not binding upon the common people. The Pharisees thought that the badge of righteousness or covenant fidelity was to make sure that they bore the marks of Jewish identity, even to the extreme. And this would guard against assimilation into pagan culture. This would guard against compromise. It was not the badge of legalism, but the badge of Jewish heritage that the praying Pharisee proudly wore. He proudly wore the badge of Jewish heritage, and in his mind, that justified him as being in covenant fidelity with God. He was the real deal. He was genuine and in the right. Now, the word justified can throw some people here. Some think that justified is synonymous with saved. But the terms don't mean exactly the same thing, although it could be argued that justified people are saved people. But Jesus himself is said to be justified in 1 Timothy 3:16, but he had no sin from which to be saved. But he was justified in the sense that he was vindicated. And that is what the Greek word translated justified actually means. It means vindicated. And to be vindicated means that a claim you have made for yourself has proved to be genuine. Jesus made the claim, although often indirectly, that he is the Son of God. He was justified or vindicated in that claim by his resurrection from the dead. And so he was justified by the power of the Spirit who raised him. The term justified is a legal term, meaning that one is declared to be in the right. The judge has decided in that person's favor. As the Pharisee and tax collector stood before God in the temple, N.T. Wright describes it as two litigants standing before a judge, each pleading his own case and waiting to see who will be declared as in the right. And that is how court cases were decided in the first century. Two disputing parties would come before a judge stating their case, and the judge would decide for one and against the other, declaring one person to be in the right or justified. And it's this justification that the widow was looking for in the previous parable of the widow and the judge in verses 1 through 8. She came begging the judge to decide in her favor, to vindicate her as being in the right against her adversary who was in the wrong. Not that there should have been such a contest between the Pharisee and the tax collector, but the Pharisee had turned it into a contest by comparing himself to this other guy. He thanked God that he was not like this tax-collecting traitor to Israel. The Pharisee was just certain that God favored him above the tax collector because the Pharisee was very scrupulous about his Jewish identity that set him apart from others. Things like tithing, fasting, circumcision, and hand washing. This misconception that Jewish identity markers affirm one's claim to be righteous continues into the church era. Some Pharisees we've come to know as Judaizers. They converted to Christ and they sought to hold on to their Jewish identity markers as the vindication of their claim to be right with God. Paul referred to this concept as justification by works, but he argued instead for justification by faith. Justification by works is not necessarily legalism. It wasn't common for a Jew to think that he was saved by accumulated merit. But many thought that the Jewish identity markers were what finally set them apart from those outside the fold. The most binding ordinance in the mind of the Judaizers who descended from the Pharisees was circumcision. Some went as far as to say that unless you are circumcised, you cannot be saved. That's in Acts 15. But just the belief that doing something in order to be saved does not make one a legalist. Everyone admits, if you press them enough, that you have to do something to be saved. You're not just entirely passive, but circumcision was never that something. The Pharisees and the Judaizers weren't necessarily legalists, but they were nationalists, and for them it's not about working your way to heaven on a merit-based system. It was about demonstrating the outward signs of Jewishness as proof that you are right with God. And it was in that sense that they believed in justification by works. While their problem was not legalism, nor was it simply the problem of binding a law that was obsolete, but it was equating Jewish identity markers with one's righteousness. They enlisted the Jewish works to function in a way that they were never intended to function. And by Jewish works, I'm talking about these identity markers. And even in the time of the Pharisee and the tax collector, when the law was fully in force, righteousness was never intended to be a matter of Jewish works. It's easy to see how the Pharisees saw Jesus as a threat. In downplaying the Jewish traditions, he seemed to be opening the door for assimilation by pagans. And they were thinking, if we don't hold on to these Jewish traditions and tout them as the justifying marks, then we might be assimilated into pagan cultures. That was their fear. And to some degree it was understandable, since many of the Jews had been assimilated through the centuries. The Judaizing successors of the Pharisees saw Paul as particularly threatening. His insistence that Gentile converts are justified by faith and not by Jewish works had some thinking that he was just opening the door to anyone. But if Jewish works are not the true demonstration of righteousness, then what is? If it's not the Jewish identity markers, does that mean that Gentiles can come into the church without bearing the marks of circumcision, without observing the Sabbath, without keeping the Jewish feast days, without keeping a kosher diet? Absolutely. Because they are not justified by works, but they are justified by faith. And that is the way it has always been. And that is why the tax collector went home justified, while the Pharisee did not. The Pharisee pointed to Jewish works as all the evidence he needed to demonstrate that he was righteous. He trusted in himself that he was righteous. His faith was misplaced in himself. But the tax collector humbly put his faith in God, which means that he trusted God and did not trust in his ability to justify himself. He humbled himself before God, saying, "Have mercy on me, a sinner." And Jesus concludes that everyone who humbles himself will be exalted, and everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. If true righteousness is defined by overtly religious ordinances, then we could pride ourselves in how well we go through the motions. And this leads to unfavorable comparisons between ourselves and those who don't seem to be quite as right as we perceive ourselves to be. We might not have Jewish ordinances like circumcision and the Sabbath, but we do have ordinances, our own ordinances, and we might categorize them into groups like the 5 steps to salvation, the 5 acts of worship. And as important as these individual items are, they might become the comparative measure by which we judge others. We might sound smug or superior if we speak of those who aren't as right on baptism or communion or on public worship as we perceive ourselves to be. Not that there is anything wrong with trying to be right, but what truly justifies our claim to be right with God is not flawless precision in religious observances, but righteousness involves justice toward our neighbor. Righteousness and justice are so closely intertwined that they're often used interchangeably. The pursuit of righteousness begins by humbling yourself, realizing that you are no better than anyone else because we are all sinners. Comparison to others is not the measurement of righteousness. Theodore Roosevelt is often credited with having said that comparison is the thief of joy. And we certainly know that that's true in regard to people who seem to be doing better than we are, because someone else always has a bigger house, someone else always has a newer car, someone else always has a more attractive spouse, someone else always has a body that is more fit. But comparison is just as much a joy stealer when we compare ourselves that we might consider inferior to ourselves. Being smug and critical does not bring us joy. It makes us bitter. It promotes an us and them mentality. It breeds contempt. Yes, people are lost in their sins and they need to be taught. But we soon forget just how lost we might have been at one time, or how ignorant we were, or how steeped in sin we might have been. The more right or obedient we perceive ourselves to be, the more temptation to look down on others that we don't perceive to be as right. And it's unjust for us to look down on others. It's unjust for us to be like the Pharisees, requiring more of potential converts than what God requires of them. It's unjust to block the door of the kingdom to those who won't affirm our extra biblical traditions. Righteousness isn't measured in terms of comparison with others, but it's measured in terms of our love for others. Faith expresses itself through love. Trust in God is demonstrated by sacrificial love for our neighbor. But contempt for neighbor is incompatible with true righteousness. True righteousness is manifested by humility. Humility, love, and trust in God. Trust is initially expressed as we humble ourselves before God in repentance of our sins, confession of Christ, and baptism into His name. And I hope that you'll consider humbling yourself before God today.